We dropped to our knees and cried together. He whispered, "If you want to leave, I wouldn't blame you. I understand." In that moment, the illusion shattered. The illusion that fame, power, and money could shield anyone from life's cruelest storms. We often imagine that the king of the stage, the unstoppable basketball legend, or the immortal Hollywood icon lives above tragedy. But behind the fame, behind the cameras, behind the applause, they face horrors no spotlight can hide. These legends have watched cancer eat away at the bodies of the people they love. They've battled vicious HIV rumors while holding the hands of partners too weak to stand. They've heard the heartbreaking sobs of wives left paralyzed for years. Some spent every last dollar, not on luxury, but on one more day, one more breath, one more moment with the person who meant everything. Today we reveal the untold stories of 20 Black artists who endured the deepest, most unbearable pain imaginable, watching their husbands and wives fight diseases no fame could cure. These stories will break you. And the very first name belongs to a man who conquered Hollywood, yet could not save the love of his life. Sidney Poitier. No one ever imagined that the man who once made all of Hollywood rise to its feet would one day be found on Valentine's night, kneeling on the cold wooden floor, trembling as he held the lifeless body of the woman he loved. Sidney Poitier, Hollywood's first Black Best Actor Oscar winner, was the symbol of dignity, strength, and unshakable composure. Yet on that night, none of it mattered. Fame could not save him. Glory could not protect him. He was simply a terrified husband begging the universe not to take away the one person who made his world whole. In 1969, Sidney met Canadian actress Joanna Shimkus, a woman with a soft gaze and a quiet beauty that instantly disarmed him. Their love grew slowly, gently, and deeply. After 7 years, they married two souls who seemed perfectly matched, a union so admired that people believed nothing could ever shatter it. But at the end of 1989, cracks began to appear, small at first, then devastating. Joanna's voice grew hoarse, fading in and out. Fatigue wrapped around her body like a shadow. One cold December morning, she collapsed in the bathroom, her hand shaking as it clawed at the edge of the sink. Sidney rushed in, scooping her into his arms, his heartbeat thundering with dread. 3 agonizing days of tests followed, then the verdict came: thyroid cancer, already spreading. From that moment, their home transformed into a private hospital. The smell of disinfectant clung to every corner. Machines hummed day and night. Each morning before dawn, Sidney rose quietly, preparing porridge, supporting Joanna as she dragged her weakened body across the hallway. His Oscar, his fame, his million-dollar contracts, none of it meant anything as he watched the woman he loved slip away piece by fragile piece. Then came February 14th, 1990, Valentine's Day. A day meant for roses and candlelight instead became the darkest night of his life. Sidney returned home from a meeting about a $3 million film, the contract still in hand. But the house was unnervingly silent. He called her name. No response. When he reached the top of the stairs, he froze. Joanna lay face down on the icy floor. The lamp beside her was overturned, blood forming a thin trail from the corner of her mouth. Sidney dropped to his knees. His hands trembled violently as he turned her over, his voice cracking into desperate whispers. The terror in that moment was unlike anything he had ever known. At the hospital, he sat alone in the hallway for hours, suit stained with dried blood, staring blankly into the distance, terrified to blink, afraid that the next time he opened his eyes, she would be gone forever. The months that followed were merciless. Treatment bills arrived relentlessly. $50,000, then $80,000, then more, each one slicing deeper into their savings. By the end of 2 years, the total had surpassed $500,000. Sidney declined films, ignored interviews, and vanished quietly from the limelight. He devoted himself entirely to Joanna, even as her once vibrant hair thinned and her shoulders slumped from exhaustion. One night, unable to bear the brokenness in her eyes, he turned away, fighting tears he could no longer hide. But slowly, after surgeries, radiation, fear, and endless nights, Joanna began to recover. She survived. Yet the ordeal transformed Sidney forever. His once upright posture curved with fatigue, and gray overtook his hair far too quickly. Later, he shared one truth with his daughter. "I used to think success was everything, until the night I realized I could lose everything in a single moment." And now, ask yourself, if you were Sidney Poitier, would you have the courage to trade fame, fortune, and the applause of the world just to keep one more day with the person you love? 2. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson, the velvet voice of Motown, the man who once wrote the softest love songs in America, never imagined that the greatest heartbreak of his life would unfold quietly inside his own home. For all the tenderness in his lyrics, not a single song could save his wife, Claudette, when lupus crept into her body and began dismantling it piece by piece. It began innocently, almost forgettably, a dull ache in her fingers, stiff enough to make signing her own name difficult. But by mid-1973, the pain had spread like fire, first to her wrists, then her shoulders, then her spine and legs. She burned with fevers over 102 degrees, drenching the sheets night after night. Her lips cracked dry. Her arms darkened into a purplish-red mosaic, the skin so tender that even a whisper of touch felt like needles piercing through her nerves. Doctors finally named the monster systemic lupus erythematosus, a disease where her own immune system turned traitor, attacking her tissues, her vessels, her lungs, her kidneys, every vital part at once. Claudette curled on the bed each night, gasping as fluid filled her lungs. Rolling onto her side sent sharp electric bolts of agony from her chest to her ribs, as if her own body were tearing from the inside. And lupus was merciless. It stole from her not only her strength, but her children. Claudette miscarried 3 times, each loss caused by blood clots cutting off life before it had a chance to form. The last time she bled so heavily that her skin grayed and her heartbeat reduced to a faint, flickering thread. In a cold operating room one June night in 1975, Claudette awoke to a doctor leaning over her. His voice was gentle but devastating. "Your chances of having a child are almost gone." She didn't cry. She simply gripped the blanket with white knuckles, forcing herself not to scream at the ceiling above her. The years that followed hollowed her out. Smokey toured endlessly, chasing stages and spotlights, while Claudette stayed alone inside their silent, echoing home, living on painkillers and a loneliness that no one could name. When she finally walked away from the marriage, there was no anger, no shouting. Because deep down, they both knew the truth. Lupus had broken their last hope long before they ever said goodbye. 3. Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield, the man whose music stirred a whole nation, whose voice carried the fire of hope and rebellion, learned in the cruelest way that even legends can fall. He wrote "People Get Ready, Move On Up," songs that lit a torch inside millions, but none of that power, none of that fame could protect him from the darkness that descended on his life in 1990. That summer, Curtis was preparing a new album, still hungry, still burning with the same creative force that made him a pillar of Black American music. On August 13, 1990, he stepped onto an outdoor stage in Brooklyn. The sky was bright, the crowd roaring with anticipation. Curtis lifted the mic, his lips moved toward the first lyric, and then, a sound like thunder. The massive lighting rig hanging above the stage snapped loose. In a split second, hundreds of pounds of steel came screaming down. The crowd shrieked as the metal slammed onto Curtis's back. He collapsed instantly. His eyes were wide open, staring at the sky he could no longer reach. His lips still shaped the words he never got to sing. In that single moment, Curtis Mayfield, the blazing performer who electrified audiences, became a man fighting to breathe, paralyzed from the neck down. But fate was not done with him. Only 4 months later, just as Curtis and his family were trying to understand their new reality, another shock struck even harder. At the end of December 1990, his wife, Althea, the woman who had stood quietly behind every triumph, was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. Doctors found the disease only after she collapsed from exhaustion at her husband's bedside. Their home, once filled with music and children's laughter, turned into a quiet battlefield where two wounded hearts tried to keep each other alive. Curtis lay immobile in his bed. Althea lay across from him, fighting her own war against a disease that was consuming her from within. Medical bills climbed mercilessly, $200,000, then $400,000, then over $600,000. Every royalty check, every dollar they had saved for their future, disappeared. Some mornings, Althea dragged her weakening body across the room to give Curtis his medication before enduring her own chemotherapy. On the worst nights, she sat on the floor beside him, her hair falling in clumps, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around his unresponsive hand. People whispered, "Why doesn't she leave? Why sacrifice herself for a man who can recover?" But Althea only looked at Curtis, tears gathering at the corners of her tired eyes, and whispered through cracked lips, "If I have to die, then let me die next to him." What tragedy could be greater? Two people who once lifted each other higher than the world itself, now lying side by side, unable to walk, unable to fight fate, waiting in heartbreaking silence to see which one would be taken first. 4. Al Green. Al Green, the honey-voiced king of Memphis soul, could silence a crowd with a single high note. But behind the applause and bright stage lights, his marriage to Shirley Kiles became a haunting reminder that love cannot always defeat fear. By 1975, Shirley had begun sinking into severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Nights became terrors filled with insomnia, trembling panic, and tranquilizers that dulled her senses but never eased her mind. Whenever Al came home from touring, he found her curled in the kitchen corner, clutching a cold cup of tea, too frightened to lift her eyes, terrified that one wrong glance might spark another explosion. Her illness made her vulnerable, but the chaos inside their home came from both sides. In court, Shirley later recounted the night Al shoved her down the stairs during an argument, a moment burned so deeply into her memory that she still heard the echo of her own scream. Between 1978 and 1981, she filed multiple domestic violence complaints, only to withdraw them out of fear of losing her home, her safety, and the man she once trusted. At her final hearing, her voice trembled as she whispered, "I don't know what frightens me more, my illness or the man I used to love." 5. Barry White. Barry White, the king of love songs, the man whose velvet voice could seduce an entire world, was celebrated as the guardian of romance. People believed his music could soothe any wound, heal any heartbreak, melt any loneliness. But behind the golden lights of his concerts, a far more tragic truth was unfolding. While Barry sang about devotion, the only woman he ever truly loved was quietly drowning in fear, sickness, and abandonment. That woman was Gazeon White, radiant, elegant, a singer whose beauty once made Barry confess, "When she looks at me, every doubt disappears." For 2 decades she stood beside him, through fame, excess, and endless nights of applause. Yet the higher Barry climbed, the further she felt him drift away. Barry buried himself in the studio, swallowed by rumors, whispers of 2 young singers, late-night sessions, doors closing behind him. Meanwhile, Gazeon locked herself inside the bedroom they once shared, numbing her sleepless nights with heavy doses of sedatives, trying to silence the ache of waiting for a man who no longer came home. Then, early in 1998, everything shattered. A violent twist of pain tore through Glodian's abdomen, sending her crashing onto the cold kitchen floor. Her hand reached desperately into the empty air, searching for someone, anyone, to catch her before she fell deeper into darkness. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was drifting in and out of consciousness. At the hospital, doctors discovered an ovarian tumor the size of a grapefruit, likely malignant. She needed emergency surgery. Frail, underweight, and trembling from months of emotional decay, Glodian whispered to the nurse, "If I don't set wake up, please don't set let him pretend he sets grieving." On February 23, 1998, while surgeons fought to save her life during a grueling 6-hour operation, Barry White was thousands of miles away, standing on stage in Paris, bathed in adoring cheers, singing "You're the first, the last, my everything." An assistant quietly slipped a surgery report into his jacket. Barry glanced at it once, then stepped back onto the stage. The show, he said, could not stop. When Glodian regained consciousness, the tumor was gone, but so was her strength. Clumps of her once flowing black hair covered the pillow. Her hands twitched uncontrollably from medication. On a shelf beside her bed sat a small white bouquet with a faint berry scent. No name, no heartfelt message, nothing but 2 cold words. "Get well soon." In the months that followed, Glodian faded from public life like a shadow retreating from the sun. No tabloids checked on her. No stage welcomed her back. The separation between her and Barry was never legally finalized, yet no love remained to resurrect. Years later, when Barry himself fell into kidney failure, they saw each other only a few more times, sitting across a long wooden table, speaking little, sharing even less. Someone once asked Glodian why she still visited him. She sighed and said softly, "Maybe when you love someone long enough, you stop knowing whether you steer loving, hating, or just waiting for the day when you both finally disappear." 6. Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice could steady storms, whose calm presence defined wisdom on screen, carried a private heartbreak few ever knew. His marriage to Myrna Colley Lee, a brilliant stage designer admired for her creativity and quiet grace, slowly withered under the weight of a disease that steals breath, strength, and hope. It began subtly. Myrna felt tired, then unbearably sore. Her joints swelled with pain. Soon a fiery red rash crept across her back, and the simple act of breathing became a struggle. After months of tests, the truth emerged: systemic lupus erythematosus, a ruthless autoimmune disease in which her own immune system turned against her lungs, heart, and blood vessels. In 2006, while Morgan was filming in Europe, Myrna was rushed to the hospital with severe respiratory failure. Her lungs had already lost over 40% of their function. Morgan boarded the first flight home. In the cold ICU, Myrna lay pale beneath an oxygen mask, each breath sounding like a war her body was losing. For years, they fought to keep the marriage alive, 2 people trying to hold on while illness pulled them apart. Some nights, Myrna stared blankly at rows of prescription bottles, and Morgan stood helpless beside her, unable to offer comfort she could feel. Eventually, they separated. No arguments, no scandals, just quiet resignation. Because lupus had taken more than her health. It had taken the belief that love alone could save them. 7. James Brown. If Curtis Mayfield spent his last years helplessly watching his wife fade beside a sickbed, then the tragedy of James Brown was far darker, because it wasn't only illness that destroyed the woman beside him, but the slow, merciless collapse of her spirit. James Brown, the godfather of funk, the unstoppable force behind "I Got You, I Feel Good" and "Papa's Got a Brand New Bag," electrified millions with his fire and brilliance. Yet behind the blinding stage lights, in the echoing corridors of his lavish mansion, a different story unfolded, one of silence, fear, and a woman slowly being erased. Adrienne Brown had once been admired for her striking beauty, bright eyes, and bold spirit. She managed the chaos behind James Brown's fame with quiet strength. But years of surviving a husband known for his volcanic temper, chaotic addictions, and violent outbursts wore her down until she was only a shadow of the woman she once was. After countless nights ending with shattered mirrors and overturned furniture, Adrienne began turning to painkillers just to fall asleep. What started as a desperate attempt to numb anxiety slowly spiraled into a dependency that tightened around her life like a trap she could never escape. By late 1995, her decline was impossible to hide. Adrienne had lost so much weight that friends hardly recognized her. Her once lively face was hollow, her cheeks sunken, her breath short and raspy. After a series of agonizing chest pains, doctors finally delivered the truth: acute heart failure. Her heart was so weakened that a single relapse, a single overdose, could end her life instantly. But even in her most fragile state, Adrienne still battled divorce proceedings, accusations, and bitter disputes over money with the man who had once vowed to protect her. She faced courtrooms with trembling hands, her voice thin, while tabloids feasted on her downfall. On the night of December 19, 1995, Adrienne collapsed on the cold stone staircase of her home, a syringe still clutched between her fingers. When paramedics arrived, her breathing was shallow, already splintering into fragments. Throughout the emergency night, her heart stopped again and again. Doctors shocked her chest 3 times, dragging her pulse back from the edge, only for her body to fail once more. Days later, Adrienne died in a Los Angeles hospital, her heart squeezing a few final times before falling silent. The medical report stated bluntly, acute heart failure from long-term addiction and severe emotional distress. James Brown attended her funeral for only a few minutes. He stood before her casket, stone-faced, then left without a tear. And as he returned to the stage, shouting about freedom, rhythm, and passion, the world quietly remembered the small, broken woman who died alone, wrapped not in music, but in despair so deep she no longer had the strength to care whether she lived at all. 8. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye could make millions weep with a single lyric, yet he remained powerless to calm the storms inside Anna Gordy, the woman 17 years older who had once been his anchor. By 1975, Anna was sinking into crippling anxiety and deep depression. Crowds terrified her. She stopped leaving the house, locking her bedroom door each night as if hiding from an unseen enemy. She often sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a small knife, convinced someone was coming to kill her. Panic attacks seized her at midnight, leaving Marvin shaking as he called for help, fearing she had stopped breathing. Their marriage spiraled into a relentless cycle of fear, guilt, and blame. When the divorce battle ignited in 1977, Anna sued Marvin for emotional damages. The trial stretched on for a year, tabloid reporters circling them like vultures. One day, Anna broke down sobbing on the witness stand, admitting she had once attempted suicide because she believed she no longer deserved to be loved by anyone. In the end, their marriage crumbled under the weight of illness and heartbreak, leaving behind a quiet, unnamed fear Marvin carried with him until the final days of his life. 9. Richard Pryor. After Smokey Robinson's tragedy, few imagined another marriage could descend deeper into suffering. Yet Richard Pryor and Jennifer Lee endured months so dark that illness didn't just break their bodies, it crushed their spirits inch by inch. Jennifer was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in late 1990. By the time doctors discovered it, the tumor had already invaded her abdomen. Chemotherapy ravaged her. In barely 2 months, she lost over 30 pounds. Her hair fell out in handfuls, her skin turned a sickly yellow-green, and even sitting upright felt like lifting a mountain. At the same time, Richard's body began betraying him. His hands went numb, his speech slurred, and his facial muscles no longer obeyed him. doctors delivered the blow: multiple sclerosis, a progressive disease that destroys the nervous system with no mercy and no cure. On the night of January 14, 1991, Jennifer collapsed in the living room. Richard saw her fall, but when he tried to move his wheelchair closer, his arms shook helplessly, unable to reach the woman he loved. Two people once defined by power, humor, and brilliance were now prisoners inside failing bodies, trapped together yet unable to save each other. They divorced, then remarried, because no one else could understand the depth of their despair. And every night they lay awake, knowing the next sunrise would bring only another diagnosis darker than the last. 10.isa He's. Few knew that behind the deep, commanding voice that once dominated the charts, Isaac Hayes spent years draining every ounce of strength trying to save the woman he loved. Isaac Hayes, the funk visionary behind Theme from Shaft, never imagined his greatest fall would come not from fame or failure, but from a quiet war fought inside his own home. In 1998, his wife Adjoa was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. By the time doctors found it, the tumor had already spread to her ribs and liver, leaving her weaker with each passing sunrise. To keep her alive, Isaac began selling off his prized vintage cars, then mortgaged their Atlanta mansion. Treatment costs soared into the hundreds of thousands. Many nights, he sat silently beside her bed, resting his hand on Adjoa's shoulder as she drifted into a medicated sleep after another brutal round of chemotherapy. By 2000, when Adjoa slipped into a coma, Isaac finally admitted to close friends that he had lost everything: his fortune, his home, his sense of stability. But he also said that if life offered him a second chance, he would make the same sacrifices again. Because all he ever wanted was to hold on to the only woman who had truly felt like family. 11. Magic Johnson. Behind the glittering arenas and million-dollar smiles, the story of Magic Johnson and Cookie Johnson remains one of the most haunting in celebrity history. When Magic publicly announced he was HIV positive in 1991, Cookie had just given birth. Her body was still fragile, and the fear of infection gripped her so tightly she spent nights sitting upright in bed, too afraid to touch a doorknob, a towel, even her own husband. But fate had an even crueler blow waiting. On April 18, 2005, while getting dressed, Cookie felt a hard lump beneath her breast. A biopsy confirmed early-stage breast cancer requiring immediate surgery. As the doctor laid out the treatment plan, Cookie said nothing. She simply stared at Magic, her hands shaking so violently that the glass she was holding slipped and shattered across the floor. The surgery took place on their 13th wedding anniversary. When Cookie opened her eyes in the recovery room, staring at a cold ceiling and feeling blood seeping from her bandaged wound, she wondered how life could still find ways to hurt them. For years afterward, she lived in the uneasy rhythm of antiviral pills and hormone treatments, always waiting, always fearing the next chapter of bad news. 12. Percy Sledge. A song traded for one final chance at hope. That was the true heartbreak of Percy Sledge's life. Some say his greatest tragedy was not the poverty he rose from, but the moment he realized that the same voice that once shook the world could not save the woman he loved most. In 1995, his wife Rosa was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, just as Percy's career was dimming. On the night of August 9, 1996, he performed a benefit concert in Alabama, singing "When a Man Loves a Woman" through tears. He knew every ticket sold was another day of chemotherapy they could barely afford. Backstage, Rosa sat silently in a wheelchair, skeletal, exhausted, clumps of hair slipping from her scalp. Each time Percy walked off stage, she squeezed his hand and whispered, "I'm sorry you have to sing to pay the bills." Percy managed to buy her a few more months, but fate was unmoved. In 1997, Rosa passed away, leaving Percy alone in a house so silent he questioned whether his legendary voice had only delayed the inevitable. 13. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Perhaps no image was more haunting than the towering Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the giant who dominated roaring NBA arenas, returning each night not to cheers but to a dim hospital room where his wife was slowly fading from thyroid cancer. Kareem, the legend who once believed he was strong enough to protect anyone, saw that illusion collapse in 1976 when Habiba, his gentle and private wife, received her diagnosis. The tumor grew with terrifying speed. Within 6 months, Habiba's voice weakened to a whisper, her breathing constantly strained. Each chemotherapy session left her slumped against Kareem's shoulder, strands of hair falling like silent confessions onto the hospital floor. Throughout 1977, Kareem canceled countless games to stay by her side, but the illness carved a widening distance between them. He couldn't bear watching the woman who once glowed with warmth shrink into a fragile shadow, while Habiba refused to let him watch her break. When the disease entered its final stage, their marriage had nothing left to cling to. Habiba quietly moved out, leaving Kareem standing alone in an empty room, wondering whether love had failed her, or whether he had simply not done enough to make her stay. 14. Eddie D. Kendricks. If Sam Moore's downfall showed how addiction can destroy a marriage, then the tragedy of Eddie Kendricks revealed something even crueler, a disease that struck both husband and wife with terrifying precision, as if determined to drag them into the grave together. In 1991, Patricia Kendricks was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer. The tumor spread so quickly she could no longer dress herself. Just a year later, while Eddie was scheduling her chemotherapy, he began coughing blood. The doctor's verdict was blunt: lung cancer. On April 15, 1992, Eddie woke in their Nashville apartment to find Patricia lying limp beside him, her chest wrapped in white bandages, while he himself wheezed like every breath might be his last. They no longer had the strength to console each other, only the strength to hold hands and wait, terrified, to see who would leave first. Patricia passed away in early 1993, her final breath taken in a quiet hospital room heavy with the sharp smell of morphine. Eddie followed soon after. A nurse later whispered that on his final night, Eddie gripped the iron bed frame with trembling hands and repeated just one heartbreaking question: "I don't know what we ever did to deserve dying like this." 15. Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron may have stunned America with 755 home runs, but when the stadium lights faded and the cheering crowd dissolved, he returned each night to a house filled with silence, and a wife fighting to breathe through pain. Beginning in 1982, Billy was diagnosed with systemic lupus and severe arthritis. The diseases attacked her joints until even lifting a spoon sent sharp waves of agony through her arms. On the night of February 22, 1986, Hank walked down their dark hallway after a long game and stopped cold. Billy was curled on the bathroom floor, unable to move, her legs suddenly paralyzed. From that moment on, the wheelchair became her constant companion. Hank sold his prized sports car to install ramps and an automatic lift, but nothing could buy back the warm smile she once carried so effortlessly. In her final years, Billy drifted through long stretches of silence, her skin pale from immune-suppressing drugs. Every night, Hank sat beside her bed, telling stories, cracking jokes, trying to summon the laughter she used to give him so easily. But in her eyes lived an exhaustion that no amount of love, not even from a legend, could ever erase. 16. David Ruffin. Among all the artists who once believed themselves untouchable, David Ruffin's tragedy stands as a reminder that not every illness shows up on a medical chart. Some begin quietly in the mind, then spread like wildfire until nothing is left standing. While David spiraled into a cocaine addiction so destructive it shattered his career, his wife Sandra Ruffin was unraveling in an entirely different way. By 1978, she had sunk into severe depression, nights of relentless insomnia, days spent numb under the weight of tranquilizers she needed just to function. On the night of November 14, 1981, neighbors called police after hearing violent crashing from the Ruffins' Detroit apartment. Officers arrived to find Sandra lying motionless on the floor, an empty bottle of sleeping pills rolling beside her. David knelt next to her, sobbing uncontrollably, his hands still trembling from drugs. Sandra survived after being rushed to the hospital, but the overdose left her with permanent neurological damage. She could no longer work, plunging the family into overwhelming debt. For years afterward, no one could say who destroyed whom first, only that two people once full of talent and promise had become prisoners trapped in the ruins of their own addictions. 17. Sammy Davis Jr. Who could have imagined that Sammy Davis Jr., the shining face of the Rat Pack, always impeccably dressed, always flashing that brilliant smile, would leave behind a wife destined to face not one but two death sentences? In early 2003, Altovise Davis began losing her voice. Then came the coughing fits, the streaks of blood on tissues. Within weeks, doctors delivered the blow: nasopharyngeal cancer, the tumor so large it pressed against her vocal cords until every word escaped as a strangled whisper. But the nightmare deepened. On the morning of September 12, 2004, routine blood work revealed another devastating truth. Altovise was HIV positive. The news was so shocking that even her closest friends sat in stunned silence. Rumors exploded publicly, some whispered about a reckless past, others about a tainted transfusion. Altovise never defended herself. She was too tired to fight the world's judgment. Sammy had already passed away, leaving behind over $7 million in tax debt. Altovise spent her remaining years auctioning off his treasured belongings, photos, costumes, memories, just to stay afloat. On her final night, she lay on a cramped rented bed, an IV line taped to her chest, her breath mixing with the damp smell of peeling walls. Friends said she once whispered that dying of illness was cruel, but dying in disgrace was the deepest humiliation of her life. 18. Levi Stubbs. Has anyone ever asked what the cruelest pain in life truly is? Levi Stubbs learned the answer the day Sklenis, the woman who had stood beside him long before the fame, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in 1998. At the height of his career, with the Four Tops preparing a major anniversary tour, Levi stunned everyone by announcing he was quitting music. No more concerts, no more rehearsals. His world narrowed to one mission: keeping Sklenis alive for as long as love would allow. He spent every night listening for her labored coughs, cooking thin bowls of porridge she could barely swallow, and covering their Detroit home with handwritten reminders for her injections. On February 4, 2001, Sklenis took her final breath on their old wooden bed. Levi sank to his knees beside her, burying his face in the blanket until morning light crept through the curtains. They once dreamed of growing old together long after the spotlight faded. But in the end, only one remained, and no song Levi Stubbs ever sang could quiet the ache she left behind. 19. Sam Moore. Perhaps nothing captured the collapse of a family more brutally than the morning of March 19, 1988, when police burst into Sam Moore's Florida apartment and found Joyce Moore unconscious in a diabetic coma, while Sam knelt on the floor, rummaging through a fresh bag of heroin. Joyce had battled severe diabetes for years. An infection had already cost her part of her leg. Her eyesight was fading into darkness. Sam once swore he would quit drugs to care for her, but addiction clung to him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. On nights when Joyce convulsed in violent seizures, Sam was often crouched behind the curtains, hiding syringes, too dazed and drug-blinded to even call for help. When the media exposed the story, the image burned into the public mind, a soul legend sinking into ruin beside a wife so sick she could no longer afford insulin to stay alive. When Joyce finally woke after emergency treatment, the doctor simply looked at Sam and shook his head. Everyone realized the same truth in that moment. Sometimes it isn't disease that destroys a family. Sometimes it's the slow surrender to despair. 20.dia Han Carole. And finally, no story feels more sorrowful than the last chapter of Diane Carroll, the first black actress ever to win an Emmy, once adored across Hollywood for her elegance, discipline, and regal presence. But when the spotlight faded, she spent the final 2 years of her life caring for her fourth husband, Vic Damone, as he fought late-stage prostate cancer. Beginning in the spring of 2000, Vic's strength drained rapidly. His hip bones became so fragile they fractured simply from brushing against the bed frame. Diane left behind the glamour. Moving with him into a small Palm Beach apartment, she washed him herself, fed him pills each morning, and quietly rejected every new role, even those from the biggest studios, because love demanded her entire heart. On the morning of October 12, 2002, Vic exhaled his final breath, while Diane held his hand, softly humming the old song they once sang together. People say that night, she sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty bed and whispering to herself, "Loving with all your heart sometimes leads you to the deepest pain." And after hearing these 20 heartbreaking stories, it becomes painfully clear the spotlight that made these legends immortal was never strong enough to protect them from real-life tragedy. Behind the fame, they sat in dim hospital rooms, powerless as cancer, depression, and illness took away the people they loved most. Which story moved you the deepest? Which fate still lingers in your mind? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps honor their pain and their legacy. Before you go, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. More hidden Hollywood stories and untold truths await you in the next video.